Well, good evening. This evening we're what are we on, number 8 of 10 in our series on the Second Vatican Council. I'd like to begin with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Look down upon me, O good and sweet Jesus, while before your face I humbly kneel. Most fervently I pray and beg you to fix deep within my heart lively sentiments of faith, hope, and charity, true sorrow for my sins, and a firm purpose of amendment. With deep affection and sorrow I contemplate your 5 wounds. I have before my eyes, O good Jesus, what David the prophet spoke of you, as though you were saying it yourself. They have pierced my hands and my feet. They have numbered all my bones. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. That's the prayer to Jesus Christ crucified. A prayer that you may be wondering, Father Braun, it's Advent, not Lent. However, we always take into account the fullness of the Paschal mystery, that Christ didn't just come into the world, but he also died a very painful and bloody death for our sins. And so we always keep before us the image of Christ and him crucified. Tonight, I'll be talking about the pastoral constitution in the church in the modern world, or Guadium et Spes. It is, as some of you may have noticed by trying to read, the longest document of the Second Vatican Council. It has words and words and words and words, and then words to explain those words, because those words were so much without any precedent. It is a document largely built in the I guess you would call what you'd call the interim period of the whole council, that it really was not originally a part of the council. The intentions of the council, Blessed John the 23rd, his collaborators never stated, we're going to make a document, we want to make a document on the church's relationship to the modern world. However, over time, they certainly realized that this would be a great opportunity to address the whole world in a way never before done. It was people like Yves Congar and Cardinal Soenens of Belgium who were pushing for this document, considered progressives in many ways by their conciliar counterparts, but at the same time men who truly saw that the church needed to engage the world around it. So they would have been men who used phrases like opening up the windows and taking down the veil, but at the same time seeking a true open dialogue, not just that we abandon all of our traditions, but that the church truly engages in the world around her. And John the 23rd himself often had this theme in mind. He wrote, in basically 3 years as our Pope, wrote 2 documents on the church and the world, Mater et Magister, Mother and Teacher, and then Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. And in both of these sought to, in a new way, revitalize the richness of Catholic social teaching. The text for this document went through 6 major revisions, and each of those sought to incorporate the teaching of John the 23rd, his predecessors, and particularly Paul VI, who during the council put an encyclical letter out on the church's relationship to the modern world. And so this desire to speak and engage the world, prompted by the Holy Spirit and the Council Fathers, ultimately came to one conclusion. Any dialogue that the church, the supernatural entity that is the church, is going to have with the world has to focus on one thing, the human person. And so the document itself, as we'll go through it, you'll see, largely speaks to just that reality, the human person. And then she'll go on to speak about the church's relationship to the world regarding the human person. And so we never really look at this document as being separate or distinct from the council itself, though its formulation in some ways came about later in the council. But what we will see is its intrinsic relationship to the document Lumen Gentium on the church, and to the documents Dignitatis Personae and the document on religious liberty. Seeing how the interrelationship of this massive document that is a burden to read, I'll be very honest with you at times, but to see how it relates to the other documents that came out at the same time really helps you to know the mentality of the fathers of the council. So I want to start, as you see on your handout, with the question, what's the difference, or what is a pastoral constitution? A few of the documents we've discussed, Lumen Gentium and Dei Verbum, are dogmatic constitutions. They are speaking specifically on matters of dogma, speaking specifically on matters of faith. And so certain elements of those documents are dogmatic proclamations. There's nothing new in them, but they're really new ways of defining treasured beliefs of our faith. And so in Dei Verbum, for example, we saw the passing of tradition. What does that look like? What is that really, how does the picture of sacred Scripture come about? And we see, as Eric did such a good job, that there's nothing really new that we were saying in the council, but we were giving it a new way of being said. It's the same old stuff, it's just a new way of being said. And likewise, in Lumen Gentium, the document on the church, we didn't say the church is doing anything different. We didn't say her essential nature was any different than it always had been. What's the nature of the church? Salvation of souls. And it will continue to be for generations to come. But what we did is give it some new language, a better understanding, maybe a clearer understanding to speak to the modern world. A pastoral constitution, which is what Guadium et Spes is however something not entirely different, but in a way significantly different. A footnote from the documents in the Flannery edition, which is this edition of the documents, says the Constitution is called pastoral because while resting on doctrinal principles, it seeks to set forth the relation of the church to the world and to men of today. The Constitution is to be interpreted according to the general norms of theological interpretation, while taking into account, especially in Part 2, the changing circumstances which the subject matter by its very nature involves. And so, while there are doctrinal elements that inform the language of the Constitution itself, the Constitution largely is addressing temporal realities. So a document written in 1965 is a pastoral document. It's largely addressing people in 1965. Now when we read it, we're going to see how this just continues to speak to us. And so there is a certain timelessness to what they're saying. But we have to understand that this is not dogmatic. 500 years from now, we could see documents that speak of the social teaching of the church that talk in a different way than what we see here. And that's not contradicting what's being said here, but it's a different way of understanding the same reality. This happens. This is the development of doctrine within the life of the church. It's not changing. It's not doing something different. It is doing something different, but it's not changing the essential core, the truth that is always present. We don't have that power. We can't change truth. None of us have that authority. Only God Himself does, and He wouldn't do it because He is truth Himself. So without further ado, we're going to get into the document. Guadium et Spes means hope and joy. So it's the desire of the Council Fathers themselves to speak to a joy and hope that overcomes the grief and the anguish of what the world had done to itself for the past 40 or so years. You know, we talked about, I know, a few times in this different presentations about how the world really had gone through 2 great wars and destroyed itself. And so in a lot of ways, we were reeling and dealing with realities we had never heretofore seen. But also our technologies were advancing. We were becoming much more globalized. We were starting to see literally intercontinental relationships. No longer was it just that the local villager in Africa knew people in the village next to him, but now he literally could know people on the other side of the world. And how much more so is that true today? That we literally have globalized our human relationships. And so in the introduction, the Council Fathers want to make it clear that the focus of this Constitution is to talk about the essence of relationships, to talk about man himself. And so it's man in his entire being, his spiritual, his bodily, his moral, and his intellectual entirety, as you see on your handout. That we can't just address man as some entity without a relationship to God. We can't address man without a relationship to other men. We can't address men without discussing that he has an intellect that's to be used to know the truth, and a will that's to seek the good. And so ever more readily are we able to enter into this dialogue when we first address the situation of man. And so the introduction, and I have a little joke on there, this is called an introduction. For a student of philosophy, if you have never taken philosophy, or if you've never really studied modern history in depth, you would read these next like 6 paragraphs and be completely overwhelmed because there is so much information packed in here about the situation of the world. And again, luckily, I hope you remember from 7 weeks ago some of those historical, philosophical, and theological influences on the council, but also on the world at large, so that you're not completely disjointed. And when you open up this Constitution and you start reading, you're like, oh, well, now I kind of see how that relates to this thing we were talking about before. So I want to read just a quote, and you have it there on your paper also. The first massive quote, really to be taken for study further, for each of you I recommend, goes like this. Ours is a new age of history, with critical and swift upheavals spreading gradually to all corners of the earth. A transformation of this kind brings with it serious problems associated with any crisis of growth. Increase of power is not always accompanied by control of that power for the benefit of man. So in probing the recesses of his own mind, man often seems more uncertain than ever of himself. And in the gradual and precise unfolding of the laws of social living, he is perplexed by uncertainty about how to plot its course. And so the council immediately addresses 3 very germane aspects. Power. Power, this is a great quote, increase of power is not always accompanied by control of that power for the benefit of man. That never before had we had the kind of power we had, not only over ourselves as persons, but over the whole world. You know, in Genesis, we're told to dominate the world. But now we have we're to the point of domination that we can not only destroy our world, but we can shoot rockets at worlds away from us and destroy them too. So we're at a place where we had never been before. And power that comes from this globalization of relationships, power that comes from, we're starting to see first world countries really, really separate themselves from second and third world countries. We're starting to see power in certain types of governments that becomes excessive and not really beneficial to the other people around them. The second phrase relates to human nature. In probing the recesses of his mind, man seems more uncertain of himself than ever. Man, as he discovers and grows, needs to always do so with great caution because we don't know what we're unlocking. We literally, and a lot of you lived through this, we day to day were discovering things that we didn't know before, but were they really going to be to our benefit? Sometimes we acted without thinking. We often acted without thinking, much like a compulsive teenager. You act without thinking. You do without reasoning. And so many people were doing that without reasoning, without thinking about the ramifications of their scientific progress or their technological progress. And so the church is warning in a very loving way that man is becoming alienated from himself because he doesn't know really what his activity is oriented towards. And finally, discusses politics. It speaks to the fact that man, as he discovers all of these new things, as he grows in a greater understanding of himself and the world around him, needs to understand more deeply how to order these goods towards the good of man without seeking selfish motivations. And so the church, not condemning, but recognizing the reality that the world is moving at a very fast pace, is just cautioning, slow down, because you may step into a mess that you really don't want to get into. And so the rest of this introduction is going to kind of discuss some of those issues. Some of the deep-seated changes that occurred, and this is in your section, it says changes, and more changes, question mark or something like that. It says, the deep-seated changes, and number 5 in Guadium et Spes, there's a dangerous attack on our spiritual lives because of technological advancements. And there are many examples, but I'll just name a few. And these are common. These are not, I'm not going to give you any mind-blowing examples, but think of a technological advancement, even in 1965, that would have completely changed the world. You think of an example? I mean, there's many, many, many that come to mind. The means of radio communication, for instance, revolutionized the way we had war. Sorry? Antibiotics. Another good example. Think about the effects of I just go back to radio communication in war. Our troops could now talk to each other from miles away. Coordination was no longer done by shooting a gun in the air or shooting a flare in the air or plotting, saying, we'll be here at 5 p.m., you'll be there at 6 p.m. We literally could talk to somebody hundreds, if not thousands of miles away on a telephone or by a big awkward radio, which is what I imagine most of them actually had to deal with. But another thing, like antibiotics, we started to develop drugs, not just antibiotics, but the explosion of artificial contraceptives occurred in this period. All of these things that actually, in a great way, somewhat helped us, but undermined much of our human relationships. When we come to the point now where we are in the 21st century, where literally we have technologies that prevent us from even speaking to one another, to being 4 feet apart from each other, and yet we're still texting, we're having dinner and we're texting each other, this speaks to the fact that we have lost the ability to communicate. There's good in text messaging. It's not to say it's not evil unto itself, but the excessive use of it, the denigration of human relationships because of it, does not help us. On a global scale, nuclear warfare. I've come back to this time and time again. The church has explicitly talked about nuclear warfare. That's why it's easy to have some conviction. Nuclear warfare is a game changer. And from that point forward, we knew that we could value, I, as a country, could value the lives of my citizens more than the citizens of another. What does that do? That rejects the dignity of the human person. So fundamentally, if our technology and our progress doesn't respect the human person, is it really progress? Is it really good for us? Well, we have to look at that. We have to kind of discern that. But it cuts us off also from a spiritual life, because in a world of constant change, commotion, and discovery, when do we slow down? Think about it. Some of you were alive in the 60s. Do you feel like you've just been running and running and running and running? Yeah, that's exhausting. I'm 30 and I'm already tired. So I can only imagine what it's been like to go through these progresses. I mean, literally, in my lifetime, we had laser discs, CDs, mini discs, video games, data phones now, or smartphones, just all those things. You guys dealt with a lot more than I did. Lots of progress. Satellites. Right, televised. Persian Gulf. Yeah, we watched on CNN. We watched people literally getting bombed to death as it happened. I mean, that's mind-blowing. So we go through this world at rapid pace, not slowing down, not taking time to say, God, where are you in all of this? And the church realizes this, and so she's trying to call us back to slow down, to seek God. She'll get into a little bit more of the change, speaking specifically of changes in the social order in number 6, and points at 4 major areas. And I encourage you to write these down and think about them. The church talks about how traditional structures of local communities, and there's a stress on local communities, families, clans, tribes, villages, groupings, nations, nation-states. 4 things that have changed fundamentally the structure of local communities. Industrialization. So what's entailed with that? Industrialization includes mass production, the automation of quite a few jobs, and what does that ultimately do? It takes humans out of the workforce. Okay, so industrialization. The next is urbanization, that we've seen families who for generations and generations were farming families, had property. Some of them had jobs that were more, service-oriented within those farming communities, but literally all over the world, thousands upon millions of people moved from farms into cities. So cities become a new phenomena, essentially, in a post-industrial era. Next thing is mass media, and this is the 60s. I mean, the Pope just got a Twitter account. Mass media in the 60s was radio, telegraph, TVs, but now literally a Pope just yesterday at Pontifex on Twitter, I don't have Twitter, but that's what it said, has a Twitter account, and he tweeted, I think that's the right word. So mass media has changed our lives for good in many ways, but we have to look at kind of the bad that's come from that too. And finally is immigration/immigration. The church recognizes there's good. If a people are in an oppressive society, they need to get out of there. Or if you're in America, for instance, and you can't get a job in Alabama, you come to Texas. It happens. That's part of life. But this changes the fundamental roots. Louisiana to Texas, I know. I can't hit everybody. I know many of you are immigrants within our nation itself. But so immigrants, I think, is the word. But that changes your dynamics, your family dynamics, your social dynamics. You go from being in the place where you had the comfort of friends for years, family members. You've got little kids. What do you do when you've got small kids and you move to a completely new city? You go crazy, because all of your network is not there anymore. And so these things changed the way we viewed relationships. It changed how we value it. Think of how the American family functions now. There are literally members of families that don't see each other for years upon years, if ever at all. Whereas even 50 years ago, your family generally may have had 1 to 2 people within a 50-person unit, let's say, that would have been beyond 100 miles. Almost everybody would have still been close enough to reach in one day. Now today, I can give you an example. I have family literally from coast to coast and out of this country, and I don't see all of them very often. And many of you share that same experience. So this has all led to one fundamental philosophical difference that it's a social difference, but it's also philosophical. We've become depersonalized in our relationships. We have a lot of relationships now that don't really seek the good of the other. We use those people for a means to an end. And this is not directly always a result of these 4 major things, but it is kind of a trickle-down result. Industrialization, urbanization, mass media, and immigration. The person doesn't know how to talk to the person anymore. And I know we pick on teenagers a lot and say, look, those kids can't talk to each other, but think of us as adults. Many of us don't have the ability to sustain more than a few minutes of conversation. So we've come to a point now where we're not able to speak with each other anymore. Then the church goes on to talk about how we've abandoned, many elements of this new social order, this new discovery has led to an abandonment of God, specifically an abandonment of God that speaks to the fact that we feel like we are now the sum of all things, and we no longer need God because we can figure it all out ourselves. And then the church will speak about imbalances in the world today. This is number 8 in Guadium at Spes. It says, ultimately, we are responsible for any conflict, woe, or distrust within the human community. We can blame it on technology, and technology doesn't always help us. But ultimately, human relationships break down because of human beings. And that fundamentally is also something the church calls us to understand, is that these things that could be used for good can also be used for evil, but at the end of the day, it's a choice how I use my iPod or my cell phone or my computer or industrialized production. If I need a piece of steel pipe to get to a oil derrick in South Louisiana, am I going to buy it from a local manufacturer, or am I going to buy it from China and then have it sent over here? These are the things that affect us, and we have to think about what is our disposition. So the broader aspirations of mankind, the church has an exceedingly, in my opinion, optimistic view of human nature. It's a good view. I say exceedingly optimistic because I think they were so worried about the Lutheran kind of view of humanity, which we've discussed before. This is me quoting him. It's not me making up. Snow-piled dung heaps. The idea that we're so rotten to our core that we can't do any good. I think the church wanted to really get away from that because that had never been her teaching, but a lot of people did think that. So she has this very optimistic view of how human beings can relate to one another. But fundamentally, we're good. We believe that as Catholics. I'll say it again. Fundamentally, we as Catholics believe the human person is good. Why? Because we're created in the image of goodness itself, God. Is that simple enough? It's a good apologetics right there. We're good because we're created in His image. But in understanding an optimistic view of human nature, the church also says, in response to man's deeper questionings, the church, and this is a quote from number 10, believes that the key, the center, and the purpose of whole man's history is to be found in its Lord and Master. She maintains that beneath all changes there is much that is unchanging, much that has its foundation in Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so her understanding, and we're going to get to this and Guadium at Spes 22, her understanding and her optimistic understanding of human nature is grounded in the fact that Christ himself became a man. That our nature was recreated in the image of Christ. And that's a beautiful thing. When we're baptized, that we share in the body of Christ in a way that before Christ's incarnation could not be known. That literally we have now the opportunity to share as baptized persons in His side is something that fundamentally changes the way we think of human beings. But human nature, again, as y'all have read and hopefully understood from theology, does suffer from some evil consequences, the consequences of the fall. And so we're going to get into that in just a few moments, but because we do understand that we are a fallen people, we know that sin still exists in the world. We know that despite all the goodness of human nature, we can still choose to love ourselves over God and over our neighbors. And so the church, again, in her optimism, also is very quick to caution us against having some sense that because we are so good that we can all do it ourselves. This is a heresy. We can't save ourselves. We need God. Any questions? That's just the introduction. That's literally 10 paragraphs. There's about 87 more, or 83 more. Chris? Yeah, yeah.
Because I know that there's a movement right now that some Catholics like getting back to more rural roots.
Mm-hmm.
Is the church like openly supporting that and saying this is good?
Yes, and you can read in, I want to say, Centesimus Annus Populorum Progressio. I have a suggested reading list in the back, on the back of these notes. I know it's in at least one of those encyclicals. And the section in here goes on a little bit longer about urbanization. I'd have to look up the Catholic, so I've read there's about 12 encyclicals on Catholic social teaching, and I've read them all, but unfortunately I don't have an encyclopedic memory, so I can't remember which one specifically talks about it, but I'll be happy to look it up for you. Jason?
There's also another one called by Pope Benedict called Handing on the Faith in an Age of Disbelief. And the whole beginning part, he just talks about how in a society where we're surrounded by everything that is man-made, everything points to the creation, the creative abilities of the human person. Water bottle points to somebody made this water bottle and put water in it and sold it to me. Everything points to the human person. And he says, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just harder to see God. We live at a constant 72 degrees. The only lights we see at night are those of cars and other buildings and stuff. It's harder for us to see God. And so that's why it's important to focus on and not lose sight of the dignity of the human person. Everything around us points to the human person, but we don't make the connection between the human person and God, and we lose everything. That's my point.
Thank you, Jason. And I'll be happy kind of towards the end maybe to get into it a little bit more or discuss it, but we need to get moving along here. Chapter 1 and part 1 on the dignity of the human person. So the Council Fathers certainly wanted to emphasize that this whole relationship, this whole dialogue cannot occur if we don't have a common ground. And so she once again stresses the dignity of the human person as created in God's image is where we can dialogue with culture, where we can dialogue with the world. And so it goes on to speak of man as being created in the image of a communion of persons, which is, for those of you who may have heard of it, theology of the body. This is JP2's kind of bread and butter, talking about the relational aspect of the Trinity itself and how we, created in the image and likeness of the triune God, share in that by our very nature, by our very being. And think about it in a very analogical and practical way. You're born into a communion of persons. Even if there's not two parents, you're still born in a relationship with a mother. You're still born into a relationship with the people who take care of you. It's the way we're created. God sees it. He imprints it upon us because He knows it's good that we have others with us. And so we understand man is fundamentally social and necessarily relational, that man cannot exist outside of himself. Even the monk who stood, have you all ever heard of the stylites? They were the ones that were on the tops of the podiums in the 300s and 400s. Kind of awesome, but kind of ridiculous. They still were in communion because you know what? Somebody had to come and help them get their food up to the top of their stoop. Somebody had to get the bucket of human waste and take it off so it didn't smell all the time. You know, they had a relationship, and they had a relationship with God. So fundamentally, they're also always in that relationship with the divine person. But no person is created without a relationship in this world. Even if they're abandoned on the doorsteps of somebody else or put into, God forbid, put into a dumpster, that person was created to be in a communion with persons. And so we fundamentally have to understand that as Roman Catholics, that we know that man is relational, and because of that, he desires to be in that relationship. Now, one of the effects of being created in God's image is that we have an exceeding amount of love. We have, because we're created completely out of God's generosity and love, we likewise seek to give that love to others. But sometimes we can pervert our love. Sometimes we seek to give love with selfish motivations and not selfless motivations. And those times, often when our love is misconstrued, can be called sin. But sin is a reality that affects all of us. And as the Catechism teach, it divides us against God, ourselves, and our neighbors. And so sin is part of this conversation. When the church talks to the world about man, we have to recognize that sin is real. That it's not some arbitrary force that causes a man to do evil. It's sin in his life. It's choosing himself over God. But the essential nature of man is not such that we want to say we're dualists either. It's not such that we want to say our flesh is terrible and our soul is perfect. No, we're a hylomorphic union. We're body and soul. We recognize that our passions are in themselves not even evil, but our inclination to act on them out of due proportion is evil. That our desires, if they're not in check with our reason, cause us to sin. But man's essential nature is good. Man's essential nature in this body-soul composite is to do the good and to seek truth. And so the church will go on to continue to speak about the goodness of man and his intellect and understanding, truth and wisdom. These are things that mark us significantly from the created order around us. I mean, the simple example I always try to iterate, and some people take offense to it, is your dog, as loving as he may be, doesn't understand that he actually loves you. He is loyal. He acts on many biological realities, mostly hormones, and then certain neurons that fire off in his brain because he's learned a repeated pattern of behavior. But your dog can't acknowledge in his mind, because he does have a little brain, he can't acknowledge, oh, I love my master. I love my master. I love my master because my master loves me. Only human beings can do that. So that makes us very different from the rest of the world around us. It's not to say the dog is bad, but the dog doesn't share in the same goodness that we share in relationship to God. And so this makes us the peak and the pinnacle of the created order. And that doesn't mean, again, that we can throw around our weight and treat the rest of the world like garbage, but it does mean that we have a higher understanding of ourselves and of our relationship to the created world around us. Because of this, because of our intellect, our understanding of truth, there's a hierarchy of truth. There's a great gift of wisdom given to us. The church goes on to speak of the moral conscience, another great gift of being a human person. We have a conscience that helps us to understand better what it is we are to do, to help us understand right and wrong. A blue whale doesn't know right and wrong. A blue whale is going to do what a blue whale is going to do. A dog's going to do what a dog's going to do. A tree's going to be a tree. That's because they're not thinking about what is their purpose in life. That doesn't ever occur to them. We do. We have these questions. We have this place in our hearts, as the church says. We have this place, as you can read along with me. Man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His dignity lies in observing this law, and by it he will be judged. His conscience is man's most secret core in his sanctuary. And there he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. By conscience, in a wonderful way, that law is made known, which is fulfilled in the love of God and one's neighbor. So we understand that the conscience is, again, a thing that a human being has. And a conscience is the place, that inner sanctuary where God speaks to us. A conscience is that place where we listen to the voice of reason. We know that it is written on our hearts to know good and evil, to know the difference. Yet we need to listen to the voice of God and to be informed so that our conscience can make a good decision. A conscience that doesn't seek to be informed is not a well-formed conscience. And so we go on to read, yet it often happens that conscience goes astray through ignorance, which is unable to avoid without losing its dignity. That cannot be said of man who takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by degrees blinded through the habit of committing sin. True ignorance permits you, even if you do something sinful, to not be in a state of sin, because you literally don't know that you're sinning. And there's very few people in this world who can say that's the case. Very few. Most of us, because God created us with great intelligence and a great gift to know through our intellect what is good and true, do not have the excuse of ignorance. And more so in a day like today, where so much is at our fingertips, where learning and having the capacity to learn is something that's in our nature, that we can understand better the true and the good, so that we do not become people who commit grievous sin over and over again. The difficulty of this teaching on moral conscience, and all of you have probably heard it, is that a lot of people took great license with it to mean that, well, I can be, if I'm ignorant of it, then I can really do what I want. No, because you can, at the same time, when I say I'm ignorant and I can do what I want, if you're also saying I'm choosing not to discern what the church is teaching, then you're rejecting your innate ability to use your intellect to know the good and to know the true. And so you can't do that. That, one, it's not intellectually responsible. Two, it's not morally responsible. To say the ease of going to the church and asking the priest, even in 1965, was relatively high. You said, Father, I need to talk to you. Set up an appointment. Okay. Father, what does the church teach about this, moral issue? There, you've had that conversation. Or, Father, do you have a recommendation for a book? Or, Father, I want to know about this. It's out there. The information is readily available. And we continue to discern on our own through the gift of reading the Scriptures, through the gift of reading the Catechism, to understand more fully what conscience is and what conscience dictates. But a well-formed conscience, if we have a malformed conscience, or if we have a conscience that we've let go through neglect, then it's no longer to make objectively good decisions. It's no longer seeking the true and the good in all of its decisions. And so it needs to be corrected. And so it stands to reason that because of a certain amount of neglect or a certain amount of choice to not be brushed up, so to speak, on the church's teachings, we become sinful. And we can't point the finger and say it's his fault, it's her fault. Ultimately, we are responsible before, as this clearly states, we're responsible before God for what we do as we act upon our conscience. It says, our man's dignity lies in observing the law of God written on our hearts, and we will be judged by that. So there's not really that leniency, I think, that maybe was perceived. The difficulty, of course, is that when this teaching came out, a lot of people had never heard of the dignity of conscience. They hadn't really thought about, oh man, we have something, it was just such a new kind of language to even be using in the church, in the life of the church, that many people, I would agree, somewhat of an ignorant way, went about proceeding. But we're 40, 50 years removed from that now. I don't think we have the same excuses that they maybe had in 1965 and 1966 and 1968. And I would argue that any of us who are in this class have the responsibility, because we're capable and intelligent people, to learn more about what it means to have a good conscience. This is not to say that you all need to go out and read moral theology for the next 3 years. It's tough. But to ask questions, to be engaged, to think in the mind of the church, to think about what does the church say about this and why. Why does she say it? That helps us to be intellectually honest. It helps us to be the best versions of ourselves we can be. I don't want to go around like being ignorant for the sake of being ignorant. I'd rather know, because it's going to call me to deeper conversion. So the church will go on then, this big topic to move, but we got to move through, is the excellence of freedom. And the relationship to freedom and conscience is very real. The excellence of freedom The church states, the people of our time prize freedom very highly and strive eagerly for it. In this they are right. Yet often they cherish it improperly, as if it gave them leave to do anything they like, even when it is evil. This is a quote from the church's document itself. And then it goes on to say, and this is kind of my 2 cents, freedom properly understood is freedom for God, the good and the true, not for myself and for evil and for lies. And this is the kind of freedom that does create distrust within the community of mankind. Freedom for God is real freedom, pure and simple. Freedom of choice, in a very liberal sense, in the way it's understood today, means freedom to do whatever I please to do. There's no real freedom in that. You become slaves to yourself. You become slaves to your passions, the ignorances of your ill-formed conscience, and ultimately there's no real freedom in being a slave to sin. I mean, what true good comes out of sin? None. So the idea that we use freedom for good, for God, for the truth, is perfectly fitting with what we think of when we think of humanity. But the church is just kind of warning, in a sense, a general warning to the world, don't get wrapped up in this idea of freedom that seeks to put yourself above and against your neighbors, because there's no real freedom in that. Ultimately, you're going to be fighting and destroying one another continuously in a cycle that the world had just gone through. But this freedom, this concept of freedom needs to be very much, I think, emphasized. And you've heard it in our homilies. Father McLaughlin, I know, and I have preached on it a number of times just in the past 6 months, because our nation has a very poor concept of freedom. As a country, largely, if you ask people what freedom means, I'll be very honest with you because I've asked, it means freedom to do what I want. And we know as Catholics that's not true. We know that that's not true. But what are we doing to change that mentality? You know, do we go out and tell people, well, no, freedom doesn't mean this? No, we often say, kind of back away and just say, well, I hope they figure it out. I'll pray for them. Well, pray for them because that is the greatest thing you can do. Pray like it all depends on God. Work like it depends on you. So talk to these people about the ills of that conception of freedom. The church desires it for you. The next thing that the church will go on to speak about in this document at length, because I don't want to go through every aspect, but the introduction and the first chapter are really extremely significant, is atheism. The church will talk about atheism and its causes. It'll point at a few specific causes, rejection of the Creator, that as we've come to dominate the created world, supposedly, as we've come to understand science so much better and to understand the world around us, we've completely disjointed ourselves from the fact that God Himself created this world. A show that many of you may watch, including myself at times, The Big Bang Theory, totally buys into this whole mentality that the world somehow or another showed up on its own because of some movement of particles at some... How did the particles get there? Pure and simple. You can't have a created world without a creator. We can't create from nothing. Humankind, when I'm in a lab, I don't magically make up particles. They come from other particles. The Super Hadron Collider in Switzerland is still using particles that were already there. We didn't create a particle that created the rest of the world. We can't do that. We're not God. So the church is just reminding atheists that that's a pretty bad fundamental philosophical position. If you reject the Creator, then you reject the world around you. Another one they talk about, and I think this is important for us to hear, is that many people become atheists, and you probably know some people that have said this, because of the hypocrisy of so many Christians or other religions. I mean, people who call themselves good Christians, yet they beat the snot out of their wives and shoot people for a living. You know, is that, not for a living, but you know, shoot people, because there are soldiers, but yeah, there are people that do it for a living, but soldiers are being an exception in a just cause, but yeah. You got people who run around as self-identifying Christians, got the big Jesus thing on their car, and yet, you know, you open up their car and there's pornography sitting on the front seat, or, you know, there's, you know, all kinds of just disarray within their own lives. The scandal of a poor Christian will undo all kinds of good work, and I hope we've all seen that in our lives, unfortunately. I've shared the personal story a few times. My dad, being a Baptist, God bless him, when he was 16, his dad died, and he was from a very small German Baptist community. You would have thought they would have, you know, embraced him and my grandmother, but they kind of just said, well, you know, sorry that happened, move on. My dad didn't want to go back to church because, and he, for a couple years, was like, I don't know about God. Why would God let these people do these things? And always the next big question is, how can there be evil in the world? And so many Christians bring that evil into the world by their very actions. And so, understandably, some people become very turned away from godly things, let alone Christianity. And the church will go on to speak of two other very awesome causes of atheism that stand in total contradiction, and that's what's so great to see how smart our church is. She talks about the tyranny of reason. Benedict will use that word, the documents don't, but how reason becomes the modus operandi. If we can't prove it through scientific theory, if we can't create a hypothesis, an experiment, and look at the data, then it's not real. Or it's not something that we can say is reasonable. So, faith. If I can't scientifically show what faith is, then faith is not anything to believe in. It's not anything real. At the same time, these same people quite often reject truth, period. They say truth doesn't actually exist. We can't say there is any objective truth. Or if there is any objective truth, it's only that which I state is objectively true. Well, what's going to happen there? Everybody's going to say, well, I'm right and you're right, or you're wrong, and we're going to end up killing each other. Because in the desire to be so right, we end up saying, oh, well, that seems like it could be true. I say it's true. If Eric Dietl says it's not true, that this is in front of me and that it's real, we could come to blows about it. I may kick him in the head, and, it's terrible. But if we're rejecting objective truth, this is what happens. We come to a point where we can no longer agree on anything being true at all. And so the irony there is that with the growth of reason, quote unquote, at the same time, we're saying truth doesn't exist. What's the end of reason? To prove truth, to bring about an awareness of that which is true. And so these causes of atheism kind of take their fullness in what's called secularism. And the church specifically speaks to systematic atheism. And I want to read just briefly a very frightening, what I found to be one of the most frightening paragraphs in this document. Even though I'd read it a number of times, I was reading it again this afternoon. I was like, good gosh, this is scary. So it says in number 20, among the various kinds of present-day atheism that one should not go unnoticed, which looks for man's autonomy through his economic and social emancipation. I can. Among the various kinds of present-day atheism that one should not go unnoticed, which looks for man's autonomy through his economic and social emancipation. What does that sound like? And don't be afraid to say it. Communism, yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. At the same time, you could look at this and you'll see that it talks about the same fears of any structure that doesn't value the human person. It goes on to say, it holds that religion of its very nature thwarts such emancipation by raising man's hopes in a future life, thus both deceiving him and discouraging him from working for a better form of life on earth. That is why those who hold such views, wherever they gain control of the state, violently attack religion, and in order to spread atheism, especially in the education of young people, this is where I really got scared, especially in the education of young people, make use of all means by which the civil authority can bring pressure to bear on its subjects. Do we teach God in any public schools? No. So while we may call ourselves a capitalist democracy, what are our schools doing? Destroying the idea of God at an intellectual level for any child. And we then say it's the responsibility of mom and dad. That seems almost, it's frightening to think that that's the reality that we're in at this point. Chris?
I just want to interject a book title here. If you really want to educate yourself in what you're talking about, there's a book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that book?
Yeah, I have. It's delightful. Yeah. And I want to say, I know there might be public school teachers in this very room. You're not doing evil. But we literally are promoting, through a very publicly funded education system, an education system that fundamentally rejects the notion that God exists. That we have to go through this every year in different states just continues to irk me to no end. And it doesn't, I mean, ultimately, if we're going to reject God, eventually we're going to reject the value of every human person, which to a great extent we already do. But once we do that, then it really is going to become that poor, nasty, and brutish life talked about some weeks ago. It's just not going to be very pleasant. So this new atheism that takes hold of man and seeks to separate man from God most often is called secularism. Secularism being kind of the overarching ideology. But it sneaks its way into every political system. It's not just communism. All this was very explicitly talking about communism. But it talks about, Pope Benedict will come to talk about it later himself in Caritas and Veritate, that the same ills can affect a democracy, a capitalist democracy. Because if our social and economic structures reject the goodness of the human person, then ultimately they're going to fail. Because the human person is the basis of every social and economic transaction or structure. So what does the church give to this? What bright news can she give to this, kind of abysmal conversation about atheism and its causes? The great statement, I mean, and as you can see in your notes, I think this is probably one of the most profound things that she said. And I'm going to just paraphrase. It's only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that the mystery of man truly becomes clear. Christ, the new Adam, in the very relation of the mystery of the Father and of His love, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high calling. But there's more. Human nature, by the very fact that it was assumed, not absorbed, in Him, in Christ, has been raised in us to a dignity beyond compare. For by His incarnation, He, the Son of God, has in a certain way united Himself to each man. It's the theological reality that's so compact right there is very breathtaking. But it's only that phrase, it's only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that man can truly understand himself. Our life only makes sense in the light of Christ. Think about it, the big questions: death, sin, hell, heaven, purgatory, relationships with other persons, social, economic welfare, moral life. It only makes sense in the light of Christ. There's no answer for so many of those questions when you reject Christ. There's no answer for the big question at the end of the day for so many people: what happens beyond this life? And I fear that so many people, because they don't like what some example of some Christian gave them, that they're not going to seek to know really what's going to happen at the end of their days. And so we have a great responsibility in imitating Christ, to whose side we've been baptized into, to bring this reality into the world, to bring the reality of Christ in His incarnation to the light of the world. Are there any questions before we move on to chapter 2? Gotten through 22 paragraphs of 93. Okay, well, the next part I want to move on to then is the community of mankind, chapter 2. There's an interconnectedness that the council talks about in this document, that we have, like I said before, at a global level, more connection than ever before. That even at a national level, we have more connections than we ever had before. And yet, have we built better relationships, or have we just built new ones? Mostly new ones. I think all of you would agree. Some of our relationships have become better because of the globalizing process or because of modern technology. I do speak with my cousin in Hawaii more now because of Facebook and because of phones. I'll say that there's good that came from that. I can see that. But at the same time, again, without these other inventions, we would have never lived as far apart as we do, because my mom would have never left Southern California. It's just the reality. So we recognize that these relationships are new, and some of them have been improved, but largely they're just new. And what happens in new relationships? There's awkwardness. You're fumbling around to get to know each other. Think of maybe the person you're married to. Maybe it was great when you first met, but let's face the facts. You probably started to notice within 20 to 30 minutes some things you didn't like about this person, because we all try to do that. We try to convince ourselves we don't like this person. So we look at, a relationship, an immature relationship. We recognize that, okay, can you get through that awkwardness? Can you see through it so you can see the real person? Or do you just start picking them apart and judging it? Well, when you're thousands upon thousands of miles apart from one another, and you're a business, and you're doing business with one another, and you have no idea who's really on the other side of that phone or on the other side of that business transaction, what do you care? It's a simple question, but it has to be asked. The church understands, and she states, that man, because he is the only creature on earth that God wanted for its own sake, man can only discover himself in the sincere giving of himself. And so in a real relationship, and you've heard about this in marriage, this is kind of a big statement. Man discovers himself only in the sincere giving of himself. This is what Blessed John Paul II will basically beat into our heads for the next 30 years. Talking about we find the fullness of ourselves and we find ourselves more fully in giving ourselves to another. And so that creates that intimate connection. It creates a connection that's necessary. And it's difficult to have that kind of connection with somebody that I don't know, that I'm completely removed from. And now, we want to build those relationships. We want to see each other better and be able to give to one another. But it very often becomes through mundane processes that we don't even know the person sitting next to us, because maybe you work in a cubicle and you've got somebody that is on the other corner. That's a lot of space to get around. And have you ever gone across and just said, "Hey, I'm Frank, how are you?" You know, that kind of thing, just small as that is, helps us to understand better what true relationships look like, that they're always, always grounded in the human person. And so this interconnectedness, this global interconnectedness, creates another reality. The person is dependent upon society, and likewise society is dependent upon the person. And this interdependence brings about this great quote I like. "Insofar as man by his very nature stands completely in need of life in society, he is and ought to be the beginning, the subject, and the object of every social organization." This will profoundly influence the church's teaching heretofore going on about Catholic social teaching. But it's what she'd been saying for 60 years previous, 60, 70 years previous. The human person stands as the very subject and center of every social organization. And so we look at the way society is organized. We look at the way economic corporations are organized. We look at the way the structures of civilization around us are organized. Is the human person at the foundation? That's fundamentally what the church is asking. It's asking China, is the human person the pinnacle of your society? Is asking America, is the human person the pinnacle of your society? It's asking GM, is the human person the pinnacle of your society or the pinnacle of your business? That's a pretty difficult thing to start to unravel, and you're like, man, how many businesses, how many transactions, how many things do I do a day that don't really think about the human person? Don't overanalyze, but just be aware that the church really believes that at the beginning, the foundation of every one of these organizations in a society, the human person must be of the highest value. So now we get into a little bit more I would call the more fun and sometimes more socially controversial subjects, not because it's anything new, the church had been saying this, but because at the time that this document really came out, it was such a time of change in our world that some of these things kind of shook up people, got them excited, maybe for good, maybe for bad. The church talks about the common good, gives a very strict definition. It's the definition that the church continues to abide by. I'm just going to let all of you know that JP2 didn't change it, Benedict XVI didn't change it. This has been a good definition to understand. The common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Added to this is the fact that the social order and its development must constantly yield to the good of the person, since the order of things must be subordinate to the order of persons, and not the other way around. Things and persons. What comes first? Persons. But that's not always the case, because as we know in our world, we've seen countless examples where things are elevated above the person. Ideologies are elevated above persons. Whole systems of governance are elevated above persons. seeking some other selfish good. And so the church understands in this teaching on the common good that fundamentally that phrase, as it's used, has a very specific definition. The sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And so what's at the center of it? The human person. So we never seek a common good that's going to reject the goodness of the person, the dignity of the human person. We never proceed in a way that's going to yield or degrade the person so that we can elevate the stuff. And the church goes on, and I think in a very telling way, to talk about its first and most practical concern. And I've said it 100 times already, but it's good to reiterate. The first and most practical concern of the church regarding the social order. So when she talks about the social order in the world, the first thing she talks about is the respect for the human person. It doesn't talk about just wages. It doesn't talk about just labor conditions. It doesn't talk about social justice, quote unquote, as it's been used. It talks about the goodness of the human person. Now the thing is all those other things I just said are related to the good of the human person. But fundamentally, her very dialogue with the world uses the language talking about respecting the human person. And so that, again, becomes the source for us to understand social interactions, economic interactions, cultural interactions. Where is the human person in all of these? And she'll go on to talk about social justice. And I've said in a different teaching, but I'll say it again here tonight, social justice is a specific part of Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is a broad umbrella, okay? And a part of that is social justice. Social justice speaks very specifically, and I'll read from the document itself, that it says, undoubtedly not all men are alike as regards physical capacity and intellectual and moral powers, but forms of social or cultural discrimination and basic personal rights on the grounds of sex, race, color, social conditions, language, or religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. It is regrettable that these basic personal rights are not yet being respected everywhere, as is the case with women who are denied the chance freely to choose a husband or a state of life or to have access to the same educational and cultural benefits as available to men. Goes on to say, furthermore, while there are rightful differences between people, their equal dignity as persons demands that we strive for fairer and more humane conditions. Excessive economic and social disparity between individuals and peoples of the one human race is a source of scandal and militates against social justice, equity, human dignity, as well as social and international peace. So social justice is a specific area of Catholic social teaching, but it's not to say that it's secondary, but it's always seen in the light of the entire body of Catholic social teaching. And I bring this up because I do think, and some of you will, I think, readily acknowledge, social justice became a flagship for really a lot of social programming. And it's good that the church is involved in social justice through Catholic charities. But fundamentally, and I think, again, it's something I've said before, it comes down to what you choose to do. The best way you can promote social justice as a Christian is to be socially just, to give yourself to those people who are less fortunate, to give of yourself in some way to help those who may not enjoy the same liberties you enjoy. If you're an employer, social justice demands that you as an employer give a just wage to your employees, give them time off when needed, that you give them fair labor conditions. That's part of social justice. Social justice is not the flagship for just saying the church is here to save all the poor. The church is here to help all the poor, but she's here to save souls. Absolutely. That's her mission. So an aspect of the salvation of souls is that she commits herself to helping the poor, that she has a preferential option for the poor. But that doesn't mitigate against the reality that at the same time the church has to promote, without equivocation, respect for human life. That these two can exist in the same order. It's a big political debate right now in our church. You're a social justice Catholic or you're a pro-life Catholic. You're Catholic, okay? You have a Catholic social teaching. I encourage you to read it, to know it, to love it more fully, and to talk to your priest about what do these specific instances mean. To go on being ignorant of the truth means that we can be culpable for that because we're choosing to willfully be ignorant. But if we choose to use our intellect and our will to understand more fully this